Hi, my name is Arkle, and welcome to my section of the conference for my project titled I'm Not Like Other Men, the intersection between vicarious processes and male sexual violence counsellors' intimate lives. First, an introduction to the background and area of research relevant to my project. So an important definition to consider for my research going forward is that of vicarious trauma, which, as defined by Perlman and Sack-Fichtner in 1995, is the transformation of the therapist or helper's inner experience as a result of empathic engagement with the client's trauma material. And this is an area there's of particular interest to sexual violence and trauma counselling, where there is such a great deal of contact with trauma narratives that can really have an impact on us as counsellors, listening to those stories and the ways in which that can shape and change our perceptions of the world, ourselves and others. So this is something that was important and overshadowed a lot of the background of our research. And we were also looking for this within our own study. Perhaps the men in our study were experiencing this, or perhaps they weren't, and that was something we were looking at qualitatively within the transcripts of the interviews, and more on that later. So now onto some more important areas of research and areas that we already know about the field of sexual violence and vicarious trauma. And this is Carrie, and she is a sexual violence counsellor. So let's consider some things that she may be feeling or experiencing in response to her work in sexual violence. One of those may be a loss of a sense of safety. Hearing and responding to our client's trauma material may remind us of feeling unsafe, or reminding us that we could be victims ourselves of sexual violence or other forms of trauma. A second one could be compassion fatigue, things like getting burnt out and not really being able to engage or find compassion for our client's trauma material can also be an effect that Carrie may be feeling. A third one is intrusion. So this could be things like unwanted images or memories, distressing us about our client and listening to their sexual violence encounters or trauma in general. And also an awareness of gender identity and power can be displayed by the therapist. Listening to our trauma, listening to a client's trauma and how perhaps their gender identity or levels of power within society or within relationships have influenced their experience of trauma can be really brought to attention to the therapist. A fifth one is healing and coping, and this is a more positive aspect of the research, which shows that listening to our clients' stories and seeing them change and grow within the therapeutic process can be very healing to the client, to the counsellor. And also, it can increase the counsellor's level of uptake in coping mechanisms to counteract negative effects of working within the field. And the most important one for us in our research is the influence on sex and intimacy. Things like decreased sex drive, trouble in relationships, lack of intimacy with yourself or your partner can all be influenced by working within this field. And fundamentally, a lot of this research has used women as the primary subject group to study. However, there is a lack of men within these studies, and so that is what we wanted to explore, the way that sex and intimacy are affected for male sexual violence counsellors. So once again, what the research has shown is that there are influences and impacts of working with sexual violence and the way it impacts our vicarious trauma. However, there is a lack of representation for men in this area of research, male sexual violence counsellors. Now, this is because there are fewer male sexual violence counsellors out there. And based on the gender bias in research, we have to assume, and we are assuming, that their vicarious trauma experiences will be the same as women's. And we also don't really fully understand how their intimate and sexual lives, much like women, have been impacted by their work. Now, our supervisor, and so we were exploratory in our nature, so we were looking at and exploring how are the sexual and intimate lives of male sexual violence counsellors impacted by their work. In particular, how have their views of consent, safety, gender and sexuality changed? And of course, if at all, because we are assuming that they have changed, or that they have changed differently to women. So now on to methods, and outlining a bit about how we actually carried out our research. The first step for us was an initial demographic questionnaire and consent form. So this was pooling male sexual violence counsellors who were registered with a counselling body such as the BACP, who had a year of experience working in the area, who attended regular supervision, who were not currently in treatment for sexual violence related trauma themselves, and who were having at least one client session per week. And from that, we were able to have an inclusion criteria that excluded others that were not within the scope of our study, and it was a struggle for us getting sign-ups for interviews, and we only managed to get 2. And these were semi-structured interviews which asked 4 questions with relevant follow-up questions, probing around the ideas of how their work has influenced their ideas and thinking around consent, gender, sexuality, and safety too. The next step was to then transcribe, read and reread those, and really get into depth and understanding how the meaning-making process was occurring for those people, for the interviewees, in the IPA frame of mind, which is what we used to organise our analysis into themes and sub-themes. And then was to triangulate first in pairs and then as a larger group to make sure that we were checking that our interpretations were along similar lines, making sure that we knew what we were reading and understanding correctly, just to check our processes and group processes to inform then our final write-up and interpretation of the data as it stood within the dissertation. So, what did we find? Now, just as a heads up, our results are still in review and analysis. So this is a preliminary view of our research, as my dissertation has not been fully submitted for final award checks just yet. So our findings. Our first theme was shielding, with the sub-themes or subcategories of avoidance, lack of openness and depth, and embarrassment. And this included other things such as a shielding from being included in wider male cultures, which things or sentiments such as "I'm not like other men." The second theme was positionality, and this included sub-themes such as maleness, power, and heterosexuality, and also things around how the therapists saw themselves within their role as a male sexual violence counsellor, such as this quote that says, "Maybe these are the shoes I'm meant to wear. I'm meant to be this man that can work with perhaps female victims in this way." And the third and final theme, and the most important theme I think for our interviewees, was awareness. So this was awareness of stereotypes, of privilege, of reflective practice and engagement in it, as also consent, and as well as men as victims of sexual violence themselves. And also this quote I think was particularly important for this area. They talked about shades of grey. It's definitely made me think more about those shades of grey. And this was in specific reference to consent, which was quite a large discussion for the interviewees, and also during triangulation process. This was a conversation that me and my fellow researchers actually talked about in great depth, this idea of consent and how it's made us think about consent, even reading the transcripts of the interviewees. So now on to the discussion, and in this section I'll go into a bit more depth about each of the themes and my reactions to it and my interpretation of what was said, and also my positionality and how I fit into all of that too. So when it comes to our first theme of shielding and the sub-themes of things like avoidance, lack of openness and depth, and embarrassment, this was very different to the women in Rachel's study, the female sexual violence counsellors who physically distance themselves from men by not spending time with men, their partners, being more cautious of being around men. This was a psychological distancing and shielding that the men in our study had shown, such as avoiding talking about topics like sex and intimacy, or when they did, lacking the openness and depth to do so, and also feeling that embarrassment as well. And I think we have to recognise the role of cultural and social influences, such as taboos around talking about sex, perhaps, are operating here. So that could be stopping men from going deeper into reflective practice and analysing their process within the room. And I think an important thing for me was, what is that holding back within the therapy room if men are not open to talking about sex and intimacy openly with their client? What is that holding back for the client and for the therapist, and how is that stopping the process of therapy, potentially, bettering the experience of the client? What is that holding back? And that's something that needs to be addressed, I think, in future research too. So the next theme of positionality was important for me, I suppose, as my position obviously influenced my interpretation of their position and how they talked about things. So it was sort of an inception of those two things, which was important. And, the sub-themes of maleness, recognising their role as men in sexism, in patriarchy, but perhaps not to an extent that I perhaps would have as a gay man, because they were talking about their heterosexual relationships and how that had or had not impacted from their work, which was frustrating for me at times, because there was a lack of representation of showing that from a perspective of a non-heterosexual man, and how they talk about women and their reactions to other survivors or other people who have experienced that abuse or violence. That was something that was absent, which was interesting, that they didn't consider that things could be different, that there could be another perspective on things. And this relates to power in, the sense of them being in a position of authority, but also their lack of an awareness of their power as men, which was something that was interesting to consider too. And also they talked about things like, meaning to be in this position, meaning to, be the kind of man that works with women in this way, which was interesting when thinking about things like a saviour complex. Did these men find that gratifying, to feel that they were the right kind of man to help this woman in a saviour capacity? And so the last theme of awareness, which was something that was talked about a lot by our participants, that their work had increased their awareness of stereotypes of privilege and of reflective practice and its importance, and also that these grey areas of consent, and also as men as victims too. And this was something that was talked about, as I said, frequently by men, and it was the males in our study. And this was something that stuck out to me as being also quite frustrating, because a lot of the things that they had talked about being more aware of during the course of their work, I, at the very start of my career, I'm already aware of that before I even started working with sexual violence. So it was a very interesting and frustrating thing to listen to, that these men were saying that, oh well, I didn't even realise this stuff until I started. So that was an interesting thing to consider, that some of these men simply weren't even aware, or not as aware of certain aspects, such as men as victims, the grey areas of consent, that I am myself already, before even being in the same position that they are down the line. So some further conclusions and considerations to our research. It is clear that the men within our study were affected by their work in sexual violence, and it had impacted them. However, it was different to that of women in previous studies, such as Rachel's, where their shielding was perhaps more physical, spending less time with their partner, less time around men, less time being intimate with other men. That wasn't the case for men within our study. The shielding was more psychological. It was a denial or distancing in their mind from other men, male culture, wolf whistling, sort of traditional or toxic forms of masculinity. That was sort of saying that I'm a different to those men. I can work with women in this way, and also this increased awareness that they had was also something that they said was most important. Finding those grey areas around consent. And also men as being victims of sexual violence too, was something that they talked a lot about, and also said that there was most important to them was realising those things. But also the shame and embarrassment felt by these men. I wondered how that was influencing their process with clients, and why it was coming up within these transcripts, and what it can be holding back within your process with sexual violence survivors within your client work. And also we can't conclude, and we didn't really observe signs explicitly of vicarious trauma within these men. It just simply wasn't there. Things like intrusion or compassion fatigue, they didn't really talk about a lot. So we can't say for certain if they had experienced this or not. So now on to some limitations of our study and also some future directions for future research within this area. So the most obvious and primary limitation of our study was a lack of participants. We only had 2 men, male sexual violence counsellors, take part in this research. And so future research should look to address this by having a wider scope of participant inclusion, perhaps from other countries, and perhaps even other sectors of work too, to hopefully address this and to get us some more rich and interesting data from a wider section of the population of male sexual violence counsellors. The next one was a lack of an objective measure of vicarious trauma. Although we were looking for evidence of vicarious trauma, perhaps qualitatively within the transcripts, we didn't objectively measure this. And so we couldn't compare, the levels of vicarious trauma to what the men had said within the transcript. So future research could perhaps look at doing this to see if their levels of vicarious trauma could be related to the content that they talked about within their transcripts. The next one was a bias of researchers. So some of the researchers and our supervisor who helped us with the research knew some of the participants that took part, and so that pre-established relationship with some of the researchers could have influenced what they said or presented like within the interview transcripts. Also, there's a cultural bias, as I said. We only had UK sexual violence counsellors who were male, so it would be interesting to have a look in future research at other countries and cultures and how they talk about their impact of their work going forward. And also there were extraneous variables, economic circumstances, things that we didn't control that could be influencing and could be very relevant to our discussions around sexual violence counselling. Especially sexuality, that was something that was very present within the interview transcripts, but it was heterosexual men that were taking part. So we didn't get a perspective from a gay man or a trans researcher, trans sexual violence counsellor, etc. So these are things that could be also further studied in future research. So we're at the end of my presentation for this section of the conference. Thank you all for listening. And on this slide I just have some references that I used to produce the presentation, also perhaps some further reading for you to consider within this area, should it interest you. So feel free to have a pause now to have a look and see if any of these sort of research studies or pieces of work interest you in your particular practice or area of work. So now that we're at the end of my presentation, there is an opportunity for you to ask some questions about my research and work, so please do send those along to me and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you for listening, and bye-bye for now.